Hi everyone, my name is Justin Goodrich. I'll be presenting with my colleagues Lucy Gordon, Ross Nehm, and Gena Sbeglia. The title of our talk today is Faculty Adoption of Evidence-Based Teaching Practices, the Role of Observation Sampling Intensity on Measures of Change. Each of us will present a portion of today's talk. In 2011, the American Association for the Advancement of Science published ambitious policy guidelines recommending evidence-based reform in the teaching, learning, and assessment of undergraduate biology. One focus of this report, known as Vision and Change, was the call for biology faculty to change their pedagogical practices away from didactic lecturing and towards student-centered learning. Student-centered teaching practices have been associated with increasing student academic performance, a sense of belongingness in the classroom, and retention in STEM fields. Student-centered learning has also been found to disproportionately benefit students from backgrounds that are underrepresented in science. Recent work has focused on measuring progress in faculty adoption of student-centered instruction at the national level. One instrument, known as the COPUS, the Classroom Observation Protocol for Undergraduate STEM, has figured prominently in this work. The COPUS is a published, validated instrument designed to collect and categorize observational data about students and instructors in undergraduate learning environments. COPUS is designed to measure what is happening in an individual class. Trained raters score specifically defined behaviors, many of which are known to be associated with active learning and student-centered classrooms. The frequency of different COPUS behaviors can be used to classify a classroom into one of three broad instructional styles. A didactic style consists mostly of lecturing. An interactive lectural style consists of both lecturing along with some student-centered strategies such as group work and one-on-one interactions. Finally, a student-centered style consists of mostly student-centered strategies. Previous work has used the COPUS instrument to measure classroom learning environments in more than 2,000 classes across over 500 instructors in 24 universities in the United States. By conducting the first large-scale set of observations, this study confirmed that undergraduate STEM courses are dominated by teacher-centered pedagogies, such as lecturing and didactic practices. This paper identified STEM faculty as complex instructors who tend to use a variety of instructional strategies within the same course. The authors concluded that the characterization of instructional practices for a given course requires at least 4 observations. The COPUS instrument has been envisioned to allow the measurement of reform efforts in learning environments at multiple scales. The class-level scale deals with the measurement of the learning environment in an individual class. Each class can be classified as one of the 3 instructional strategies defined previously. The course-level scale deals with the measurement of the learning environment within a course and takes into account the strategies used in multiple classes. A traditional course can be defined as one with consistently didactic instruction among all the classes sampled. An active learning course is one with consistently student-centered instruction, and a transitioning course has multiple instructional styles occurring among its classes. An example of a transitioning course is pictured on this slide. The small circles represent each class within a course, and the different colors among the classes indicate their different instructional styles. Finally, the instructor-level scale deals with the measurement of the learning environment across an instructor's semesters of the same course. This is the scale that can measure faculty change through time. However, although the COPUS has been widely adopted as a measure of classroom learning environments, there are important questions that must be answered to guide the use of the COPUS instrument in a manner that allows for valid inferences about reform. Specifically, the number of classes necessary to generate valid inferences of the course-level learning environment is largely unclear, which calls into question whether there has been sufficient sampling to make valid claims about reform-based teaching practices at the national level using COPUS.
Utilizing COPUS as a classroom observation tool, we ask, how many classes must be observed in order to generate valid inferences about course-level learning environments and faculty change? Has prior work using the COPUS sampled sufficient numbers of classes in order to make valid claims about reform-based progress at the national level? This project was carried out in large undergraduate gateway biology courses at a research university in the Northeast United States. We conducted COPUS observations on 3 faculty teaching these courses over 4 consecutive spring semesters. Faculty in 2 of the courses have been enacting reform efforts for the past several years. Recordings of each instructor were observed on 10 to 11 class days over each of the 4 semesters. This approach resulted in 40 to 44 classroom observations per instructor for a total of 128 observations. COPUS observations were conducted by 3 researchers who were certified to conduct observations using the COPUS by an expert evaluator after achieving an inter-rater reliability score of above 0.8. For each classroom observation, observers marked the presence of 25 behaviors occurring in 2-minute intervals throughout the duration of the class. A sample of the behaviors being recorded are pictured here. The resulting data were then uploaded into an online platform called the COPUS Analyzer. The COPUS Analyzer uses the submitted data to categorize each class into one of 3 instructional styles. We then calculated the actual proportion of each instructional style for each course out of the 11 classes sampled. Next, we randomly sampled classes within each course at varying sampling intensities to simulate varying number of observed classes. We repeated each random draw 1,000 times, resulting in 1,000 replicates for each sampling intensity. We then evaluated the proportion of replicates that were close enough to the actual proportions for each sampling intensity. Finally, we repeated these steps for 4 semesters for each instructor.
Keeping these methods in mind, let's consider these 2 fictional courses taught by 2 fictional instructors. A sampling intensity of 4 and 8 are shown for one of the fictional instructors. At both sampling intensities, the observed proportion of each style exactly matches the actual proportion. However, the sampling intensity begins to matter when the instructor varies in their instructional style across classes. Different patterns of observed proportions would be found for a sampling intensity of 4 and 8 in these cases. In one random draw at a sampling intensity of 4, you might select these 4 classes highlighted in red on the left, which correspond to these observed proportions on the right. In another draw, you could select these 4 classes on the left, corresponding to these proportions on the right. This process of randomly selecting classes was repeated for 1,000 replicates at each sampling intensity. Inevitably, some observed estimates will be closer to the actual proportions than others, as can be seen on the right. But which replicates should be considered close enough to the actual proportions? To answer this question, a conceptual framework is needed to guide the measurement of reform practices. There are 2 ways to conceptualize reform. Reform can refer to the most common behaviors enacted. This is the glass half empty perspective because it focuses on what is missing. Alternatively, reform can refer to enacting evidence-based practices at any frequency. This is the glass half full perspective because it focuses on what is present, even if at small magnitudes. We operationalize these reform conceptualizations using 2 thresholds within which observed proportions could differ from the actual proportions. For example, at the less conservative threshold, the highlighted proportions on the right would be considered accurate. But at the more conservative threshold, one of those estimates would no longer be considered as such. This threshold was designed to capture rare instructional styles or small shifts in the frequency of each style across time, which aligns with the glass half full approach to reform measurement because even small progress towards student-centered instruction is captured with a high probability. Our first finding is that at the class level, instructors used various instructional styles. This set of graphs is the result of 1,000 random samples of those classes drawn at varying sampling intensities. Each graph shows the relationship between the sampling intensity on the x-axis and the percent of acceptable replicates on the y-axis for each course each semester. We report that using the less conservative threshold, the number of classes needed to accurately estimate instructional style varied depending on the instructor and range from 1 to 7. The red line and red text indicates the sampling intensity at which there was a high probability of accurately estimating the 3 instructional styles. These results suggest that an observer who conducts COPUS observations at the sampling intensities in red have at least a 75% probability of reporting accurate proportions as defined by the less conservative glass half empty perspective on measuring reform. Using the more conservative threshold, the number of classes needed to attain a high probability of accurately estimating each instructional style also varied depending on the instructor. However, in this case, the classes range from 1 to 10. Next, looking at the instructor level, we found that 2 instructors were dynamic over time and 1 was consistent using only didactic practices. For this first instructor, an observer that conducts COPUS observations on 7 out of the 10 total classes had at least a 75% probability of reporting accurate proportions in each semester as defined by the less conservative glass half-empty perspective on measuring reform. Conversely, using the more conservative threshold, this observer would have had to conduct COPUS observations on 9 out of the 10 classes to reach this high probability of accurate measurement. For the second instructor, the number of classes needed for accurate measurement are similar to that of instructor 1 for both the less and more conservative thresholds. Finally, for instructor 3, sampling 1 class each semester was sufficient regardless of the perspective on measuring reform. This slide summarizes the ranges of sampling intensities needed for accurate measurement reported in this study. Notably, the sampling intensity depended on the instructor, the level targeted, and the researcher's conceptualization of the measurement of reform. These ranges are derived from an analysis on 3 instructors observed about 11 times across 4 semesters. The exact ranges presented here are not necessarily broadly generalizable and should be applied carefully. But what is generalizable is that the sampling intensity needed to accurately measure classroom environments is likely larger than has been identified in prior work. In many cases, more than 4 classes are needed for accurate measurement, especially if taking a glass half-full approach to measuring reform. Having answered the first research question, I will now present results for the second question. Staines et al. Presented findings on COPUS observations from over 2,000 classes. However, only 3 courses in their dataset, each taught by 1 instructor, were sampled at least 11 times. These 3 courses are thus comparable to our dataset in that they facilitate a comparison between the observed and the actual classroom dynamics. We applied the same analyses that were presented earlier in the talk to these 3 courses and compared the accuracy of varying sampling intensities. Class-level data for these instructors are shown on the left, and the course-level results are shown in the middle. We found that the number of classes needed to attain a high probability of accurate estimation were within the ranges reported for research question 1. At the sampling intensity shown in red, observers would have at least a 75% probability of accurately estimating each of the instructional styles. Conversely, at a sampling intensity of 4, the minimum number of classes recommended by Staines et al., an observer would have only a 50% probability of accurately estimating each instructional style. The vast majority of the courses in the Staines et al. Dataset had 4 or fewer classes observed, which calls into question the validity of the claims made about these courses. Finally, because there were no instructors with enough classes sampled across semesters to conduct an actual versus observed comparison through time, the accuracy of the measurement of instructor change could not be evaluated with the Staines dataset.
The sampling intensity required to accurately measure the classroom learning environment varied among semesters and instructors, but was generally much higher than 4. This sampling intensity is too low to detect reform occurring in the classroom and is unlikely to accurately characterize reform measures at the institutional and national level. Our results indicate that current sampling using the COPUS is insufficient to make robust and precise claims about instructor behavior in undergraduate STEM courses in the United States. The sampling intensities needed to accurately measure reform differ depending on how reform is conceptualized. A glass half full perspective, in which reform is conceptualized as referring to enacting evidence-based practices at any frequency, even a very low frequency, required a higher intensity of sampling than a less conservative glass half empty approach.
We should expect variability in instructional styles as faculty begin adopting new behaviors, which will impact the sampling protocols we use. Given the high sampling intensity needed for accurate measurement in many situations, the COPUS might not be the most cost-effective tool to measure reform, especially early in these efforts. These results raise questions about the appropriate applications of the COPUS and suggest the usefulness of more cost-effective tools like the DART. They also suggest the value of implementing pre-observation assessments to estimate instructor reform base. Overall, it is important to carefully consider how to use COPUS in a manner that will allow valid inferences about the classroom environment. To that end, our results suggest the following flowchart. I will not go through this chart in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about it after the talk. Our work advances the measurement of reform in science education by incorporating a probabilistic sampling approach to the measurement of learning environments and faculty change, considering reform occurring at the course and instructor level as important scales to be measured in a manner that allows valid inferences, and clarifies the conceptual framework of reform and articulates how it aligns with measurement goals. In summary, research designs need evidence-based guidelines on sampling intensity in order to help researchers and administrators accurately measure the adoption of student-centered behaviors. This work is an important step in that direction.